Hello, Alison Penfold. Happy days. It's lovely to have you on the Leadership is Language podcast for the Picture You in Agriculture movement. Welcome.
Hi, Catherine. It's great to catch up with you too. It's been too long since we've been able to do so in person, so it's lovely to have this online chat. Hope you will.
Yeah,
Looking forward to our conversation here for sure.
So am I. I've been busting. Alison, this podcast or webcast is about leadership is language, and I guess the confluence of both of those things. Could you talk to me a little around what's the definition of leadership? To you, what does leadership mean?
Well, look, I've sometimes felt a bit of an accidentally falling into leadership positions. So it's been, I think it's like, I don't know that anyone is necessarily a born leader. I think it's a learning experience. I think it takes curiosity, bravery, courage. But over time, what I've come to see, and I think, is really critical, particularly in agriculture, is about anticipatory leadership. It's really around being able to use strategic foresight to identify issues and opportunities, risks and opportunities, and get ahead of the curve. Because what worries me deeply is that when risks escalate, that costs farmers and producers. How does it cost? It costs because of, regulation has to step in. And frankly, as good as regulators can be, regulation in a crisis is often inefficient. Yes. And costly. But also, risks escalate, they'll impact things like the cost of capital for farming and access to capital for farming. And, I know I've made some controversial comments recently, but what I am concerned about is that the shift by climate change campaigners away from fossil fuels to meat, and the focus on meat. And what I've been seeing over a lot of time are those signals of change that to me say, hey, there's issues coming, we need to get on the front foot, and collectively work together to get ahead of them, so that we're in control of managing the risk. We're not actually divesting it or delegating it to others, including government, to manage on our behalf. I think anticipatory leadership is for me, absolutely critical in any leadership job that I will have now and will have in the future.
I love that, Alison. And I think with anticipatory leadership, you need an extra special level of courage and clarity of communication skills, because you're bringing up things that are pretty icky and pretty ouchy. And in order to put those across in a way that enables change, you need good communication skills. Because, and I guess like picking up on one of your points, before this meeting, was that just because people don't like hearing it doesn't actually make it any less true. And so the risks are still coming at us. I guess we can choose to address those risks and be proactive rather than reactive. And then you've got the legislative burden, you get very bureaucratic and rigid in your operating because you're dictated to, all of those sorts of things. So can you give us some examples? I mean, obviously you were on Landline on the weekend talking about the red meat sector. Do you want to just chat to us a little bit about that and maybe give us an example?
Yeah, look, I think there's sort of two issues that are separate but at the pointy end are intertwined.
Yeah.
And the first is around understanding, identifying, having those strategic foresight tools to see the weak signals of change, to see issues maturing, which they do over time, and understanding what phase of maturity those are in, and then understanding how you can respond to them. So, you know, that is what, let's call it that sort of social license assessment piece, the risk assessment piece, and the setting of this of the kind of strategy around how you respond. The separate piece is, how do you communicate? How do you communicate that journey? And I know, and I'll go to an example in a second. I know that calling out risks, and I did it when I was at Live Export. I can remember standing up in Charters Towers at a beef forum, sort of talking about sledgehammering of cattle in Vietnam, and that there was, you know, more there were issues occurring, and I remember, and that was, you know, ahead of activists calling it out. I know, you know, that to me was again anticipatory leadership. It was a shock. No one had heard somebody from within the industry calling out risks like that, but I was acting responsibly because, you know, it was around the journey. Going, you know, it's not, you know, we started A, we wanted to get to Z. We, you know, Live Export stood up and said, hey, we acknowledge that our performance in the past has let the sector down. The challenge for us is, how do we address those animal welfare issues offshore, do more than what SCAS requires the industry to do. And frankly, the investment in training overseas workers in the supply chain has been incredible, absolutely incredible, and full credit to the live export sector for doing that. You know, it was basically doing what I call the Dave, declaring the dilemmas, acknowledging the problems, creating a shared vision, then allowing others to evaluate our performance. And so, you know, I know that doing the D and the A of the Dave is incredibly challenging. Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Yeah. Because the other side is DAD, which is decide, announce, defend, which is, you know, this is very much, and again, from the kind of from a right to operate mindset. Yeah. It's our farm. We'll decide what we'll do, and we'll tell people what we're doing, and we're going to defend it, you know, come hell or high water. I understand that, you know, while I'm sitting in Canberra, you know, as a teenager, my parents moved from Sydney, bought a beef cattle farm, turned it into a poll Hereford stud. Was only small, but, you know, I did spend many years, you know, in and amongst, albeit a small cattle property. So I'm not immune, you know, I have lived and breathed, you know, for a time being in the industry as a child of parents running a property. Yeah. You know, the decide, announce, defend, I can completely understand. And so when somebody comes out and calls out risks, that really challenges that mindset. But there's freedom and agility and control in the Dave approach. Yeah. And, you know, in the comments I made on Landline, that is, it is about using the Dave. It is about feeling, you know, calling out the risks and feeling that you're you know, being able to, you know, not control, but, you know, you're in charge of a narration. Yeah. You're not responding to others, third parties calling it out. You're calling it out. There's some power in that. And so, you know, for me, you know, as hard as that is, and I understand people's passionate reaction to my approach, and, you know, certainly comments somehow that I'm anti the sector. Nothing could be further than the truth, but I genuinely understand how confronting my approach is and how different it is. Yeah, and I love that, the Dad and Dave model. I just think it's extraordinary, because I think the Dave model allows us to be proactive. It allows us to take charge of the practices that we use on farm. You know, farmers know better than any bureaucrat ever will about what works and what, you know,
functionality on farm and all that sort of thing. And with the dad model, whether we like it or not, no longer is legislation the only thing that's going to dictate how you operate on farm. You know, there's evidence of people not buying wool from mulesed properties anymore. So it's actually become a trade and market access issue as well. So I guess for people that are still in denial that the world is changing, and we, whether we like it or not, need to be a part of that system that is changing, I guess, you know, to deny that and to just say in the dad model, well, we're going to do it and you can, you know, nick off, is actually going to, in the long term, be quite detrimental to their business and, if not managed properly, the industry more broadly.
Well, I mean, there's sort of almost three models. There's again, and you know, the world has changed, and once the right to operate was a model that was accepted, people didn't, you know, the way the community viewed farming was very different. So I can understand right to operate. Then there's the regulatory right to operate. Now, the problem having that mindset is there's an assumption that the regulatory settings are aligned to community expectations, and often they're not. And we saw that absolutely again play out with live export. You know, there were regulatory settings in place. The risks clearly escalated to crisis. There was a significant gap between expectations and regulation. And look what the government did. That turned effectively animal. I mean, as I said, that shirt fronted, you know, the beef sector and agriculture. And then the third, so I worry about having a regulatory right to operate mindset. You know, and again, my mantra, I'm firmly in the camp of the social license to operate mindset. And it's not this kind of nebulous sort of thing, you know, there's actually objectivity, there's actually there's tools and diagnostics that sit within that frame that allow you to actually anticipate change, engage in it. It gives you the advantage of the first mover principles. Again, you know, rather than having to respond and feel defensive, you're actually, you know, taking the community on that A to Z journey, you know, either in alignment with their values or in fact ahead of it. And there's so much power in that. I mean, I can remember, and you know, live exporters worked very hard to put together a social license strategy back in 2014. And I can remember, you know, just executing a small part of that in terms of comms. And the change was profound. You know, I remember one interview where the first question the journo asked me, I could feel the anger. You know, she was ready to combat, and you know, using the tools of risk communications. What happened was the emotion. I addressed the emotion. And from that allowed me to bridge to the story that I wanted to tell. Right. And I think, you know...
What are the tools? You've mentioned the tools a few times. What are the tools you use to sort of do that style of communication?
I mean, one of the things is what you know, and I've been on a journey here. You know, I came out of politics. I was ready, or, you know, fight, you know, push your point, you know, shout louder. You know, I came from that background. So, you know, it was a revelation to me, hey, actually, if you are just pushing your point, you're miscommunicating with the other person. And so what I learnt was that no one comes to an issue as a blank slate. You know, you either disagree or agree, you've got no opinion, or you're ambivalent. And what happens is, and so I understand when you're talking to people who agree with you, they want to hear all the positives because they're attuned to you. But the biggest challenge, and this is what probably I didn't get across effectively enough with the interview on Landline, is those three other audiences require a different style of communications. because there's a risk communication seesaw. If you only tell one side of the story,
Yes.
you can, and not actually address what the other side is thinking or feeling, they're feeling dismissed, ignored, or denied.
Yep.
What happens is that creates a sense of outrage.
Yeah.
And that can spin and spin and spin and create this vortex of opposition, which can have huge influence on the operations of your industry, i.e., again, vortex, live export, mulesing, there's a climate, a range of them occurring, GMOs. So
chemical use.
I use that risk communications not to spin, because the community has a big BS radar, right? They know if you're trying to pull one over them. So you've got to have the substance that sits under it. But by responding to the emotional, intuitive sense of risk,
yes,
and you're actually creating a bridge to tell the story, to engage. So you're not sort of talking like this. You're actually having a conversation and a dialogue and taking people on the journey. Can I add why that's also important? Because on the one hand, you've got, people have values and ethics, and they're making more and more decisions around what they eat, around based on those ethics and values.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got, on the one hand, activists who are talking a language that the consumer and, these people that are ambivalent, that are weighing up both sides of the story, maybe about, the amount of meat they have in their diet. If the activists, are lining up with those views, the industry is just saying, we're doing this, that, and the other, and, blah, 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 and they're not aligning. Who is the person going to listen to? It's probably that way. And we've seen that in terms of some research we've done on animal welfare. So I want the industry to be able to tell its story, that, as proudly as I know that they do now, but just to tweak the way that they do it so that it's more effectively engaging with audiences. Sorry, I'm passionate about this, Catherine.
No, I love it. I bloody love it.
Very passionate.
And I guess, if I can reflect what you've said, if someone's talking to me, it doesn't matter how passionate they are about it. If they haven't actually asked if I'm interested, I'm not listening anyway. So,
Exactly.
someone who is a aerospace engineer, they can be talking at me, but unless they've actually found out a little bit about me and about why I might be interested, they can talk at me all they like, but I'm not listening. So I love that sort of risk comm seesaw, where you've got to, promote your story, but also understand where the concerns are and address those so that you bring the audience on. And let's be honest, in today's day and age, social media, everybody's a communicator. We need people to come on board with us, because ultimately they're spending the money at the supermarket. Yeah.
So, my message is to all of those very passionate, beef producers or anyone else in ag that wants to tell their story, is that, the audience isn't the same. There's not a one size fits all. And, risk communications, which is what I, learned to use during my time at ALIC. I know how effective it can be at allowing you to tell that story. And as you say, you're listening to what people are saying and you're engaging on the things that matter to them, not necessarily straight off the bat what matters to you. And if I think, I know that there's so much great effort in the beef sector to be responsive on so many issues. And I know that there's a frustration out there that why isn't this working? And I just ask people to be curious about the why, maybe be curious about if they're listening to what I'm saying now, and to sort of ask some questions about, well, is there a different way, and how do we learn about it, and how can we do it as an individual producer? Because this isn't something that people who've studied communications need to. Anybody can do this, and I want to transfer what I've learnt to the beef community so it can get its message out there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you say around curiosity, Alison, because that's something that I'm really passionate about in leadership. And I guess, like, if I'm confronted with anything ever, I guess what I practice in leadership, and I'm not good at, like I'm not perfect at it by any means, but being able to practice being curious and asking why certain things are, it takes you to sort of drop your ego a little bit and become questioning and being like, well, why isn't what we're doing working? We're trying really hard. I've genuinely got the best interests of the industry at heart. Yet we're still facing these risks. We can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. So I love that sort of be curious thing. Another sort of question that I'd love your thoughts on is, people say we need to just tell our story better. I'd love your comments on that.
Well, again, I think I love the stories and I just genuinely love them, but I see the frustration on many people who are, trying to get across, hey, we're listening, we're hearing, what people are wanting from agriculture. I think the challenge in part is if you've got, an industry is judged by its worst performer.
Yep.
And the challenge in this is that if you've got a cohort of farmers, producers who are, leading the pack in terms of responsiveness, but you've got no means of differentiating from those who may be struggling with change,
yes,
then everybody gets judged by the worst performer.
So how do we
and that? Pardon? What was that?
How do we address that as an industry? Because
well,
I guess that speaks to the question of why don't we just talk about the positives? Why don't we just sell our story better? But actually what I'm hearing you say is that there's a little more in that. Yeah,
I mean, it is, and it's I think it can be done, but it is a big job to build, internal alignment. And if it was really great to see, listen to Melanie and Josie on, in the landline story yesterday and get their different perspectives. And, I definitely think the sustainability framework is part of the responsiveness to maturing views around the beef sector. I think one of the challenges is that you've got, if there's a framework that's set up, there's a bunch of tools now that are being developed to help farmers, embrace, the practices that are necessary that are aligned to the framework.
Yes.
I think what we've got and what we saw play out yesterday is there is internal outrage around the framework.
Yes.
And, if you look at some work that MLA did back in about 2014, there are quite a range of cohorts of beef producers that have very different risk appetites across a whole range of measures. And I think, what's playing out here is this fear they're losing more control. There's this sense of powerlessness over what they do on their farm. And, and what I fear myself is that the toolkit that's being developed to assist farmers to align to the sustainability framework is what I would see as a hazard response to outrage, i.e. it's a technical response to helping producers engage on the framework, but it's not addressing the underlying outrage. And there's 50 years of science around risk. There's a technical expert assessment of risk and there's emotional intuitive sense of risk, and they're barely correlated. So if you try and address outrage with a hazard response, I don't mean to sound technical, right? Then you're misaligning. Yeah. And so what I would love to see, in terms, and this goes to telling the story, because it goes to how do we create a pathway, an entry point for different people into sustainability. There are leaders and there's those that fear change. And I'm really concerned about the ones that are, fear the change, feeling powerless, feeling, this is involuntary, they've got no say over what's going on. Hey, how do we engage them? How do we bring them along and listen to them and get to what's underlying their concerns. And I think that's critical if we're going to be able to, ensure that telling the story doesn't actually, we have all these people telling the story, but the gap that activists then can play to is, hang on, the industry's out there promoting this wonderful story, yet, hey, this is what's going on.
There's a real juxtaposition.
Yeah, and that happened with Live. Pre-2011, there was good work going on, right? Yes. There was engagement in market around animal welfare and handling, but that was the story that the industry was telling. Yep. We know that and there was, the abattoirs, etc. Hey, big differential, gap for activists to walk straight in, consume it, and lead the narrative. I don't want that anymore for ag or beef.
Yeah. So really what we need to do, what I think I'm hearing you say, is that we need to, like, you've got innovators, you've got laggards. At the moment, we're pitching all of our stories where the innovators are operating. And then that's like a cognitive dissonance between what's actually real and what people, and that's where we constantly come unstuck, because the activists will go into a really poorly run piggery or hen house or feedlot or, like a farmer that's eroding the crap out of their country because they've overgrazed or whatever it is. And we know in ag that that's not the reality, yet that's what they focus on. And they use that by saying, well, this is what industry thinks. And there's a lamb in a green paddock frolicking. And then they show a photo, which is, you're seeing it, that's not the case. So it's about actually, how do we, and it comes back to leadership again, is how do we actually bring the laggards, understand what their fears are, what's stopping them? Is it and I mean, it's a massively complex system. Is it political? Is it economic? Is it environmental? Is it legal? Is it social? Like what actually?
Psychosocial.
So, all of those things are part of it. But until we actually address that, it's actually interesting. I know this isn't about me, but when I was in the States, the Whole Foods, Whole Foods is a marketing supply chain. It's a massive supermarket over there, and I was fascinated.
I love it.
Yeah, so the 5-star system, and you can
instead
great. Of sort of saying to the laggards or whatever, you need to be here. You go, well, make a couple of changes, and then you're here, and then you're here, and then you're here. So you can. It's anyway. I was just listening.
It's a pull through.
Yes,
I mean it's the entry points. Like you can have. The top of the line, like, the investment in this, biodiversity certification scheme that the government's invested in. And it was great as David Littleproud's chief of staff to work to, create, to be involved in getting, getting that investment available for industry. Yep. But that's going to be pitched up here. How do you, again, create the entry points so that people can, it's not a huge step change, that people, because, there are challenges around, investment in change, and that is one of the critical risk factors that was identified in that MLA work in 2014. So I think, that is important. I think there's space to kind of do an analysis between current practice, regulatory settings and activist demands and community expectations, because I think that will highlight some areas as well. And of course, the other challenge is, and one that is going to be controversial, Catherine, is do you have to set a benchmark for performance so that if if an incident happens, at least you sort of say to the community, hang on, we've set the benchmark. This is unacceptable. At the moment we say it's unacceptable, but there's no benchmark. Now that is not going to appeal to that cohort down here, and I understand that. So I'm not. These are the difficult conversations that I'd love to see happening, and a willingness to engage. Not as sort of someone's against the industry by having these conversations. I'm a friend, I'm a passionate supporter, but I'm doing it differently to others. I get nothing out of it. There's nothing other than, what people might say about me on social media, you know, but there's nothing else in it for me other than I want to see ag in its entirety prosper, boom, you know, and you know, producers not to be burdened by, you know, by regulation or feel like they're at the whim of politicians who are, you know, I feel you know, are an unreliable defence in response to crisis or you know or change.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. I think like, I guess everyone has their own experiences and everyone sort of has their own values, beliefs, all the rest of it. And historically, ag has been left on its own. And the communication landscape is changing so rapidly now that almost that control is being taken away from us. And, you know, you can get on the bus or you're going to get left behind. And that's an awful thing to say, but you know, it's going to be the reality. And we've seen it with activists breaking in and shutting down farms. You know, that abattoir, I remember an abattoir in Gippsland about 10 years ago was, it was a family run abattoir, and activists got in there and shut down the business and they lost the abattoir because of activism. So it's uncomfortable and it's icky and it's challenging and confronting and all of that stuff. But without having these robust conversations that push and challenge. And I guess I'd encourage people to, and I mean, I'm the same. I look at things and straight away I'm confronted and I'm like, ugh, I don't believe in that and I don't like that. So I'm not going to whatever. But I try now and be like, well, hang on, why did that prick me? Like, why was that hurtful? And going back to your point, I guess, is to get curious. And think, well, why am I having that response? And is it actually a risk to my business?
I mean, can I just say, you know, what I'm seeing now is activists dictating the policy settings for agriculture.
Yes.
And my message simply is it doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
It actually does not have to be this way. And that is what I want.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm, you know, I'm engaging with the sector as best I can, you know, to share my thoughts and you know, contribute in any way that I can. But I, you know, want to get a message out there that this assumption that there has to be opposition is a fallacy. There does not have to be opposition. The power is there for the sector to retake the narrative, not necessarily, not in a combative way, in a responsive way. And you know, I mean, I'd love to, you know, I want to, you know, help people get there if that's a desire. I think it is, but it's going to, as you say, it's going to be icky. It's going to feel a bit weird. It's going to feel counterintuitive, but there's evidence it works, you know. And in ag, the evidence is there.
I love it. So, Alison, in summing up, we've had discussions about the risk-com seesaw. We've discussed being curious. We've discussed having sort of a benchmark and looking at programs. We've discussed the cognitive dissonance between, you know, the way that industry portrays itself and the realities sometimes of the industry and how they're different. I'm wondering just if in finalising you could leave us with some sort of key messages around communication and leadership, or language is leadership, leadership is language, all of that sort of stuff that can be some take-homes for the audience.
Well, look, if I can leave one message, and it was something that I remember from when I was dealing on social media a lot with people that were pretty cranky about live export, and that was, remember that you're not just engaging with the person that you're communicating with, but you're communicating to everybody that's listening to that conversation.
Yes.
And, you know, a lot of people are making judgments about your credibility, you know, the substance of what you're saying. They're listening to how you behave. And so that cordiality and respect and genuinely trying to listen and engage, you know, in a conversation, be it on social media, be it in person, around these issues and telling the story, you know, it is really important that that you understand that there's that dynamic playing out, and that there is, you know, influence isn't just going to be what you say, but it's how you behave.
Yes.
And you know, so that's part of the telling the story piece. But you know, all I can say, I guess, in addition, is all power to the ag sector. The opportunity is there, the pathway, the runway is long. Yes. But it's time to sort of strike now, to unpack the risks, to use the tools, including risk comms, and change up the narrative, change up that feeling of control and power over, and make the sector future fit.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Awesome. All right, Alison, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to drinking that six-pack with you.
We will. I owe you, I promise. Thanks, Catherine.
Take care.